Okay. On behalf of VVAW and the other organizations represented here, we sincerely want to thank everyone for showing up and supporting us. My job is just to introduce the speakers. That's the good news. I don't have to give a speech and you don't have to listen to it, but I'm going to introduce the speakers. Before I do that, I want to give you one brief anecdote. A couple of years ago, I was talking to another guy in VVAW, and I said, you know, I've always thought that Memorial Day should be an apolitical sort of event, because we're mourning the men and women who died in the service, if not necessarily their country, at least of their government. And my friend said, you know, Paul, if we were more political and more outspoken and more aggressive, maybe we wouldn't have as many brothers and sisters to mourn every year. So, yeah, we're gonna be real political. We will be appropriately solemn because this is a solemn holiday, but you're gonna hear from a wide range of people. I'm not one of them. I am gonna introduce our first speaker, who is Meg Miner. Meg is over there. She's a retired Air Force technical sergeant who worked as a jet engine technician and an aircraft maintenance technician on F-16s. Meg is a Gulf War era veteran who served in Germany and Turkey. She left the Air Force in 1995 after 16 years of active duty. She has a bachelor's degree from Northern Illinois and a master's degree in library science from the U of I in Urbana. Meg is presently employed as an archivist at Illinois Wesleyan College in Bloomington. Meg, it's all yours, my dear.
Thanks a lot. I'm really happy to be here with you today. I've been hearing a lot of stories coming out of Washington, D.C. these days, and they sound a lot like tall tales to me. I've got a story to tell you today that happens to be the truth, and it happens all the time, and it might have even happened to some of you here today. In today's voluntary military, marketed toward the young and directionless, recruits are told that they will be part of long, honorable traditions, but the people they serve may be quite different. They may not know much about honor. The story I will share comes from a written statement by Deidre Cobb. She's 21 and the Army is currently processing her as a conscientious objector. Deidre joined the Army to get away from home and to get an education. I will read to you some of what she has learned. This is a quote. Almost daily, I hear the weapons explode during tests at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds. I feel the foundation of the building that I'm standing in rattle and its metal innards shake, and realize that the weight that I must endure through this conscientious objective process is nothing compared to the terror that our weapons will inflict upon the people that this government is targeting. And so this is why I must continue with my objection. I'm an intelligence analyst for the U.S. Army, and I have thrown down my arms and refused to plot against the so-called enemy. I have no grand political knowledge of our grand political plan. With access to classified information provided only on a need-to-know basis, even those such as myself with a top-secret security clearance find that accurate information is hard to come by. Information is constantly shifting here and there, and what you thought existed at one time no longer exists 2 seconds later. It's a distant illusion. So how can the American people claim to know anything? The only knowledge that I had as I prepared to participate in this operation was of a grand psychological scam. I declare I will wash my hands of this filthy, moral, and humanitarian tragedy once and for all. Thank you, Mr. President. My eyes are wide awake now. The Army did a great job of instilling their 7 stated values in this qualified and anxious soldier. Those values are loyalty, duty, respect, selfless service, honor, integrity, and personal courage. And they are the values that have guided me through this conscientious objector process. I see so many people being infected with so much hate and greed and blind conformity, one following right after another in a daze, in a trance, in a terribly deep trance, and it is overwhelming, and my heart bleeds. And I sit here in limbo telling the world my story, which is our story, so that those who may have even a little curiosity about why so many people are screaming, "Not in my name," may have some inspiration. Or possibly there are people who have a passion for peace that needs reviving. People who need to hear they do make a difference. Oh, what a powerful energy that whole can make when they choose love and peace and compassion. At the end of her statement, Deidre includes a poem she wrote. After thousands of years of war, and we are still too blind to see that all we are accomplishing is the death of you and me. She closes with the quote, "Be the change you wish to see in the world." That's a quote from Gandhi, and that's what I think Deidre has learned. Her story is still in the making, but she has demonstrated a personal commitment to change by refusing to support policies she no longer believes in. She has changed her life, and when she is discharged, I have no doubt she will work to change the world around her. Now, I've done my share of armchair quarterbacking. I've been known to sit with a beer or two or three and complain about the way things are. And then I started coming to events like this, and before I knew it, I was causing trouble for a politician now and then. Well, I gotta tell you, the people who are at the top of my shit list these days are in the Bush administration. And I've got a list of grievances that would stretch from here to the tip of the Sears Tower antennas. How about you? What can we do about all this mess? Here's what I'm thinking. Everyone talks about how powerful the American public is. We have a right to complain, and we frequently do. And it doesn't matter if it's a manager of a company or a member of Congress or the president that's screwing up. Our voices have a place in this country, but it's up to us to make our voices heard. No one has ever come to me with a public opinion poll. How about you? I don't think anyone ever will. Since no one has come asking me, I'm taking my complaints to our elected, our public office holders. And if you've taken the time to come here today, maybe you are willing to go a little further too. Will you take the time to write to Congress, talk to your friends or family, call the White House? Will you question the motives behind the experts trotted out in front of the TV news? Will you write to your local paper? Will you vote? If you're already doing these things, will you think of something else that you've been putting off doing? One thing I know for sure is we've got to get this administration out of office. And we cannot stand by in silence if we want to keep this democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meg. Our next speaker is Doug Rokke. Doug, where are you, buddy? Okay. Doug has spent 35 years in the Army, either on active duty or in the reserves. He remains in the reserves. He's a major. His service ran from Vietnam to the first Gulf War. Doug has a PhD in physics and technology education. And during the Gulf War, he was assigned to prepare soldiers on how to respond to nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare. Doug, you want to come on up, sir?
Good morning. My name's Doug Rokke. I'm a Vietnam and Gulf War veteran. Today, when we go to war, we must remember that the casualties that occurred during the war continue for many, many years after. There are combat veterans all over this plaza today. Some have been injured in war, and a lot have been abandoned in war. During Gulf War I, we went to war, and the technology of war resulted in environmental contamination and adverse health and environmental effects that are lasting to this day. That happened in Vietnam with Agent Orange. We used Agent Orange with devastating results that are still plaguing not only the Vietnam War generation, but also their children and many generations today. During Gulf War I, we made a conscious decision in the beginning of December 1990 that we would blow up Iraq's chemical and biological stockpiles in place. That decision was made by General Norman G. Schwarzkopf at the command headquarters. We knew exactly what Iraq had because we gave it to them. That's correct, ladies and gentlemen. The United States gave Iraq their chemical and biological munitions that they possessed. We then blew them up, resulting in a continuous contamination all over the theater of operations. We then had immunizations that caused adverse health effects. We had oil well fires that caused adverse health effects. And then, ladies and gentlemen, what we consciously decided to do was use uranium munitions. Uranium munitions are illegal by the United Nations. They're a weapon of mass destruction. However, they're an extremely effective combat tool. In February of 1991, General Schwarzkopf ordered me to clean up the uranium munitions mess. I'm still trying to clean it up. What we saw when we got up there can only be described by 3 words: oh my God. The casualties are horrific. The contamination was substantial. And it took our team 3 months to clean up the friendly fire casualties and the equipment destroyed during Gulf War I. We never succeeded effectively. To this day, ladies and gentlemen, the Gulf War casualty count is not 767 that's in the official records. According to the United States Department of Veteran Affairs, the actual official Gulf War I casualty count is over 221,000 of America's finest sons and daughters on permanent disability and well over 10,000 dead. And the casualty count continues and continues and continues to grow. In Gulf War II, we went to war again, and we released technology that resulted in substantial environmental contamination and adverse health effects, not only to American warriors, but also to all of the other coalition warriors and civilians throughout the area of combat. Uranium munitions were used again. Those of us in the U.S. military that have the responsibility for uranium munitions put a warning out that they shall not use them. However, they did. We also know in a recent broadcast from the British Broadcasting, BBC, within the last 72 hours, that the United States, it has been confirmed that the U.S. used uranium munitions in Afghanistan. And also the Afghan refugees are now showing up with uranium poisoning and adverse health effects. Ladies and gentlemen, the technology of war has resulted in devastation for which we can no longer provide medical care and for which we no longer have the ability to clean up the environment. Ladies and gentlemen, war has become obsolete. We must choose ways for peace. As a warrior, I know the effectiveness of weapons. However, I also know as a warrior, from an old time as a Vietnam and as a combat medic and going up as a medical officer, that we must take care of our veterans wherever they are and from whatever war they're injured in. However, today they have been abandoned. U.S. Department of Defense willfully acknowledged in congressional hearings that they did not do the pre-deployment physicals required by congressional mandate prior to deploying the troops for Gulf War II. Right now, they're trying to figure out how they do the medical care when they return. According to messages from the Office of the Surgeon General of the United States Army, the troops are returning with malaria. The troops are returning with all kinds of respiratory problems, all kinds of rashes, all kinds of diarrheal problems. Again, war has resulted in environmental and medical catastrophe. I'd like to close with reading something from my talk in the United States Senate on Veterans Day in 2000. My namesake was General Douglas MacArthur. My dad was a World War II veteran that was at Pearl Harbor. Duty, honor, country. We have the ultimate obligation as leaders of the world to provide medical care or medical care recommendations to all that are sick. Finally, we have an obligation to complete environmental remediation of contamination caused by our deliberate actions throughout the United States and the rest of the world. I want to recite a poem that I wrote in memory of Sergeant First Class John Sitton, a Vietnam and a Gulf War veteran, who answered his nation's call during 2 wars. He was my friend. He is a true American hero because he set up and ran the 3rd U.S. Army Medical Evacuation Radio Communication System during Gulf War I. It is ironic that the warrior who saved so many lives died abandoned on the battlefield of political denials. This poem is entitled Forgotten Warriors. One moment an individual was walking through a meadow of flowers. In the next moment, sons, daughters, husbands, wives became soldiers. They defended our nation and paid with their life for their health. The citizen soldier, the Minuteman. Our nation is built on their willingness to respond to our nation's call. Some fought the jungles of Vietnam, yet many responded to fight in a distant desert war. They fought with skill and determination and freed a land. Then our nation's warriors returned home to parades and parties and joy spread from shore to shore. But when the glow subsided, the warriors remained alone and forgotten. We asked them to fight, and then we forgot to provide them medical care. We researched and studied and searched for a cause, delaying response for ignorance and fear. Yet the forgotten warriors suffer in silence with honor and hope. For all the forgotten warriors want is medical care. Ladies and gentlemen, we have an obligation to do what is right for God, our warriors, and the citizens of the world. I will never quit until individuals are cared for and environmental remediation is completed. I was ordered to complete that mission as a soldier, and I will succeed even in the face of adversity. Today, I ask for your help. Unlike another warrior, I am one old soldier who will never fade away until all veterans are cared for as we owe them for their sacrifices to our nation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doug. Our third speaker is Jen Tayabji. Jen is the director of the Illinois Disciples Foundation, which is on the University of Illinois campus in Champaign. She's been very active in the anti-mascot movement. Even you folks from Chicago know about Chief Illiniwek. He's what the white man wants the red man to look like and act like. Jen has been very active against that. She's also been active in a lot of women's issues, Take Back the Night, for one, and of course very active in anti-war issues generally. Jen, where are you? Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. I want to talk to you today about the casualties of war, the U.S. war in Iraq. It's so easy to believe, based on what popular media shows us, that there are few casualties of the war. But in an unjust war, any casualty is one too many. In this war, we have lost over 100 soldiers. Hundreds more have been injured. More than 2,500 Iraqi soldiers have been killed in combat, while thousands more Iraqi soldiers were wounded in battle. And what about the civilians? Recent reports indicate that a minimum of 1,250 Iraqi civilians have been killed since the fighting began March 20th. Thousands more have suffered injuries. Unfortunately, the Iraqis have been suffering since the first Gulf War and the sanctions that followed. In addition to these military actions, the U.S. has imposed harsh sanctions against Iraq that have had severe impacts on the people. An astounding 250 people die every day in Iraq because of these sanctions. 5,000 of these deaths due to sanctions each month in Iraq are children 5 years of age or younger. Sanctions limit the food supply, medical supply, and equipment necessary for maintaining the health and livelihood of all Iraqis. And it wasn't until last week that these sanctions were lifted by the UN. Unfortunately, the casualties don't end there. Millions of us in the U.S. will suffer as money needed for social service programs is redistributed to fund the war and falling interim government. The U.S. will be spending at least $95 billion on a war in several months of an interim government, and yet the U.S. will be running the highest deficit in history. Where is this money coming from? It is being taken from education and social services, which are already strapped for money. Schools are closing, VA hospitals are shutting their doors, and people are living without health care. Yet we are spending an exorbitant amount of money on an unjust war. Even our civil liberties have become a casualty of this war. Immigrants are being rounded up without the right to counsel or to due process. The war on terrorism perpetuates discrimination against Muslim peoples and takes away our right to privacy. We live in a state of fear, not perpetuated by simply the terrorists, but by our own government. So even though the fighting in Iraq may have ceased, the war continues. That is why we must be out here today, and why we must continue the struggle. People will suffer long after the war and fighting is over. As long as people suffer, we must recognize it and struggle to end it.
Thank you very much, Jen. Our next speaker is John Zutz. John joined the Army in 1969 after he got out of high school in Madison, Wisconsin. He served in Vietnam. He was honorably discharged in 1971 with a 20% service-connected disability. John attained the rank of private first class. This is why I love John. We both topped out as a PFC. Some guys just aren't born leaders, I guess. John marched with Vietnam veterans against the war in the 1970s. He's presently a national officer with VVAW, a director of the High Ground Veterans Memorial and Vietnam Veterans Against the War, Chapter 324 in Milwaukee. John?
need a stinking microphone, eh? I was working on this speech the other day, and I was just having a hard time getting excited. You know, I wanted something impressive. I wanted something stirring, and I just wasn't getting inspired. So I did what any high school student would do, and what most of our government leaders are doing these days. I turned to the internet. So if anything I say today sounds familiar, it probably is. Sue me. You already ought to know this stuff anyway. Anyway, I'm going to ask you to use your imagination a little bit today for me. First of all, I want you to see me coming in for the landing on that carrier. Now, I really need to tell you that, hey, I was a pilot in combat. Of course, my vehicle was a 5-ton dump truck. So, and, you know, I like to call myself a pilot because when you think about it, there's not much difference between a dump truck and a bomber. You load up on the base, you take your load to the designated drop-off point, you drop it off, you come back. So, one's a driver, one's a pilot. You can never figure that one out. Of course, you know, the pilots were all officers. You know, the airplane pilots and chopper pilots, they were all officers. Us drivers were just, you know, enlisted guys. And I figured that had to do with the pilot's walnut-sized brain. So, now, imagine me coming in for the landing in my dump truck. Well, that's not exactly right either. Because they didn't teach Army guys how to land on carriers. You had to be in the Navy to do that. So, imagine I'm in a Navy dump truck. And the Navy guy is driving, so I'm just a passenger in the Navy dump truck. And the Navy dump truck, of course, has the tail hook on it so you can land it on the carrier. Now, you can see how absurd that all sounds. But it's an absurd world. And you can see me now, just getting out of the dump truck, getting onto the deck of the carrier. I've got my flight helmet tucked under my arm. I'm wearing my parachute, and it's cinched up real tight. And all the boys and girls that actually run the ship are applauding. And it makes you really feel good. And you look up and you see the big sign, mission accomplished. Well, like I say, it's an absurd world. But the story that I just told you isn't any more absurd than reality. What's really absurd is that a person who went AWOL for a year during the time of war is now respected as a military leader and has become a commander-in-chief. I went AWOL for 6 days. They charged me $150 and made me make the 6 days up. And it's also absurd that this same Chief Chicken Hawk can attempt to cut $250 billion from veterans' pensions, health care, and disability payments. I get disability payments. He wants to cut my payments. That ticks me off. And it ought to tick you off too. And what's really absurd is that this same idiot can mortgage the future by borrowing trillions and trillions of dollars and give it to his billionaire buddies. And still have a reputation as a tax cutter when everybody that thinks about it has to know when you borrow that money, you have to pay it back someday. And where do you pay it back from? Well, citizens have to pay taxes. So that tax dollar that goes to pay off the debt is a dollar that isn't going to pay for education or health care or environmental protection or any of that kind of stuff that actually helps people. So the money's already been spent blowing things up. But hey, now we got to replace all those cruise missiles that we use at $1 billion a pop per cruise missile. Sorry about that. I've got to use my hands, guys, sorry. That's what's truly absurd. But going back to the internet, I was cruising around and you know, looking at some of the Memorial Day pages and stuff like that. You never saw so many virtual waving flags, and you never heard so many chintzy virtual music, patriotic songs as on these Memorial Day pages. But looking at the pages, I discovered that there's actually some disagreement about who came up with the idea of setting aside a day to remember those who died in service. Everyone seems to agree that it started near the end of the Civil War, and the version I get, the version I like best, describes a group of Southern women. Now it's time to use your imagination again. These Southern women wanted to remember those who died, and I imagine they talked to their friends in the sewing circle or the quilting bee. They got them together and they said, let's all get together and go out and remember the boys that are planted out in the cemetery. And so one warm spring day, I can see them. They're dressed up in their best clothes, and one woman comes out of her house and walks down the street, and she's joined by another woman. She's joined by another woman. Pretty soon, there's a whole flock of them. They're walking down the street out to the edge of town to the cemetery. And of course, they're there to remember their Confederate brothers and friends. And they're carrying armfuls of flowers. They probably picked them out of their own gardens because they're going to decorate the graves of these Confederate veterans. They get out there and they're putting the flowers on the Confederate graves, and somehow or other they realize that, hey, there's Union graves here too. They said, well, all right. So they decorated the Union graves too. Now, the original Memorial Day had an element of mourning, as well as an element of forgiveness and reconciliation. Now think about that simple act, decorating the enemy's graves. Certainly, there were some who called them traitors. They were giving aid and comfort to the enemy. But they went ahead and did it anyway. Imagine honoring the Iraqi dead with as much enthusiasm as our own Army and Marine veterans. And I think that's what Memorial Day ought to be. A reminder that war has costs on both sides. And the price is paid in gold, to start with, but it's paid in lives as well. And we keep paying, and we keep paying for it as long as we live. But Memorial Day also should be a rededication to a peaceful existence. And I'm afraid that too many of our current politicians find that thought just too absurd. Thank you for coming.
Very much, John. Our next speaker is Luis Adolfo Cordona. Mr. Cordona is going to speak about Union repression in Colombia. He's going to be speaking with the assistance of an interpreter. Luis.
Good morning. Compañeros, nos encontramos aquí para conmemorar una vez más el fallecimiento de los héroes luchadores de la guerra.
Brothers and sisters, we're here today to commemorate the fallen heroes, people in war.
Y debemos luchar siempre para evitar que haya más guerras en nuestros pueblos del mundo.
And to continue the struggle so that there will be no more victims of war.
También mostrar nuestro apoyo constante a favor de los compañeros sobrevivientes de las guerras,
and to show our support as well for the veterans of wars,
a los cuales muchas veces el gobierno norteamericano ha dejado abandonado a su suerte,
many of whom have been abandoned by the U.S. government,
para que miles de familias no sigan sufriendo el horror y el desastre de las guerras.
and so that thousands of families, people do not suffer the horrors of war.
Tenemos que luchar todos juntos porque todos somos hermanos.
We have to struggle together. We are all humans. We are all brothers and sisters.
Yo soy colombiano.
I am from Colombia.
En Colombia vivimos una guerra demasiado sangrienta,
In Colombia, we are suffering from a very bloody war,
la cual nos ha costado miles y miles de muertos,
This war has cost us thousands and thousands of lives.
Guerra financiada por el sistema norteamericano
This war has been financed by the U.S. government
a través del famoso Plan Colombia,
through the famous so-called Plan Colombia,
a través del neoliberalismo
and as a result of neoliberal policies,
y la famosa globalización,
as well as globalization,
a través también de las grandes multinacionales asentadas en mi país,
as well as because of the large multinational corporations that are in my country,
pero en especial por la transnacional Coca-Cola,
but especially because of the multinational Coca-Cola,
la cual viene desatando una guerra en contra de sus trabajadores y de los líderes sindicales,
which has been carrying out a dirty war against its own workers and union members,
la cual nos manda a asesinar a través de los grupos paramilitares,
and through its paramilitary groups, Coca-Cola has been assassinating its workers
para podernos arrebatar las ganancias que hemos obtenido a través de las convenciones colectivas,
to increase its profits and fight against the benefits that we have won through our struggles and through our collective agreements.
Por eso que quiero invitarlos a que nos acompañen y nos apoyen en el boicot que iniciará el 22 de julio en contra de Coca-Cola a nivel internacional.
And that's why I ask all of you to join us in a world boycott of Coca-Cola products, which will begin on July 22nd this year,
el cual llevaremos a cabo con las universidades, escuelas de secundaria, sindicatos, iglesias y todas las organizaciones que defienden los derechos humanos en el mundo.
This boycott will be carried out with the support of high schools, universities, churches, and human rights organizations around the world.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. Our next speaker, our penultimate speaker actually, is Denis Mueller. Denis is a filmmaker who produced Citizen Soldier several years ago. That's a documentary on Vietnam veterans against the war. He's presently finishing a film called You Can't Be Neutral on a Moving Train. That's based on the life of Professor Howard Zinn. Denis?
Howard Zinn is a veteran. He was a bombardier in the Second World War and participated in the first use of napalm in the European theater. This had a profound effect on his thinking. And as he goes around in the lectures, and I followed him around a lot in the past 6 years, he often talks about the veterans who fought against the war and came back to fight against it. So I had to call him up during, May for this reason or that, to tell him actually we were finishing. Hey, Howard, we're not going to follow you around anymore. When you see me, we'll have no cameras. And I also knew I wanted him to write something about the Memorial Day. And he said, well, I already have, Denis. Why don't you look at the Zinn Reader? And there is a article that I wrote some years ago. I think it's still pertinent. During the time in 1974, Howard Zinn wrote an article bi-weekly in the Boston Globe. And I got the date right. On June 2nd, 1976, in connection to the Memorial Day of that year, he wrote this article. After writing this article, his column was canceled. Memorial Day will be celebrated as usual by high-speed collisions of automobiles and bodies strewn on the highways, and the sound of ambulance sirens throughout the land. It will also be celebrated by the display of flags, the sound of bugles and drums, by parades and speechings and unthinking applause. It will be celebrated by giant corporations which make guns, bombs, fighter planes, aircraft carriers, and an endless assortment of military junk, and which await billions in contracts to be approved soon by Congress and the President. Memorial Day will be celebrated, in other words, by the usual betrayal of the dead, by the hypocritical patriotism of politicians and contractors preparing for more wars, more graves, to receive more flowers on future Memorial Days. The memory of the dead deserves a different dedication, to peace, to defiance of governments. There was a young woman in New Hampshire who refused to allow her husband, killed in Vietnam, to be given a military burial. She rejected the hollow ceremony ordered by those who sent him and 50,000 others to their deaths. Her courage should be cherished on Memorial Day. There were the B-52 pilots who refused to fly those last vicious raids of Nixon's and Kissinger's war. Have any of the great universities, so quick to honorary degrees to God knows whom, thought to honor these men at their commencement time on this Memorial Day? No politician who voted funds for war, no business contractor for the military, no general who ordered young men into battle, no FBI man who spied on anti-war activities should be invited to public ceremonies on this sacred day. Let the dead of past wars be honored. Let those who live pledge themselves never to embark on mass slaughter again. The shell had a number on it. The blood ran into the ground. Where his chest ought to have been, they pinned the Congressional Medal, the DSC, the Medaille Militaire. All Washington brought flowers. Woodrow Wilson brought a bouquet of poppies. Those are the concluding lines of John Dos Passos' angry novel, 1919. Let us honor him on Memorial Day. And also Thoreau, who went to jail to protest the Mexican War. And Mark Twain, who denounced our war against the Philippines at the turn of the century. And I.F. Stone, who virtually alone among newspaper editors exposed the fraud and brutality of the Korean War. Let us honor Martin Luther King, who refused the enticements of the White House and the cautions of his associates and thundered against the war in Vietnam. Memorial Day should be a day for putting flowers on graves and planting trees, also for destroying weapons of death that endanger us more than they protect us, that waste our resources and threaten our children and grandchildren. On Memorial Day, we should take note that there is such a shortage of housing that millions live in dilapidated sections of our cities, and millions more are forced to pay high rents or high interest rates on their mortgages. There's $90 billion for the B-1 bomber, but people don't have money to pay hospital bills. We must be practical, say those whose practicality has consisted of a war every generation. We must not deplete our defenses, say those who have depleted our youth, stolen our resources. In the end, it is living people, not corpses, creative energy, not destructive rage, which are our only real defense. Not just against other governments trying to kill us, but against our own, also trying to kill us. Let us not set forth this Memorial Day on the same drunken ride to death. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dennis. Our last speaker is the gentleman directly behind me who's been doing such a wonderful job of holding up this banner. Let's give these guys a hand. They're really working hard. I'm going to replace David now because see if I can hold it up. David Curry served as a captain in the military intelligence in Vietnam. In 1971, he also served as Secretary-Treasurer of the late Mayor Harold Washington's Welcome Home Parade Committee, and later as the Mayor's Veterans Advisory Committee. Dave is presently a professor of criminology at the University of Missouri in St. Louis.
Forget about the wind when you're away from here. I've got an honor to bring that into our memory, Harold Washington. Harold Washington, above all else, in many of our opinions, and I see some of you here, many of you here who were around during his administration, was the greatest mayor that Chicago will ever have, and unfortunately the greatest mayor that Chicago may ever have. In addition, I want to make 3 points about Harold Washington. He was a veteran. He cared about veterans, and he supported and worked with Vietnam veterans against the war, or allowed us to work with him. In World War II, Harold Washington served in an engineering battalion that built an airfield on a small Pacific island. His unit received a unit award for meritorious service. He rose to the rank of first sergeant of his battalion, which, you know, listen, and how hard that is. We officers haven't got a clue. According to the history of Chicago mayors maintained by the Chicago Public Library, Harold Washington left military service a highly decorated soldier. Harold Washington was elected in 1983. Within the year, he was already working with veterans toward having a welcome home parade for veterans. He worked tirelessly, and his allies worked tirelessly to bring about that parade and make sure it was a parade. The mayor counted on a lot of us for that. Maud DeVictor, Barry Romo, others here, and it was good to serve somebody that I really wanted to follow. I don't get that opportunity many times in life. In 1983, I saw him speak for the first time. There used to be a Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fountain up there that's gone. I noticed it must have gone somewhere, maybe. But one of the first things Mayor Washington said was that no one had he was a veteran, and no one should ever challenge the right of a veteran to be against war. He said all veterans should be against war. Finally, on our 20th anniversary of Vietnam Veterans Against the War as an education, Mayor Washington declared for Chicago that the city be Vietnam Veterans Against the War Day, officially. And a Memorial Day will never pass that I don't remember him as the leader and the veteran that so many of us were glad to follow. Thank you.
Thank you, Captain. That concludes our presentations as far as speakers goes. What we're going to do now is ask the speakers who have spoken today to take the Vietnam Veterans Against the War pins and ceremoniously lay them at the Veterans Eternal Flame. We do sincerely want to thank each and every one of you who are here today. We wish there were several thousand of you, but that's fine. We love you all and thank you. If nothing else, I hope we've been able to reinforce the fact that you can support the troops and not necessarily support all kinds of stupid, reckless words of imperialism under this administration. If someone would please explain to me who came up with the insane notion that the best way to support the troops is to send them to die and to kill others. My sweet Lord, I don't understand that. Thank you all so very much. We love you.